This book is rare because an eBay seller says it's rare. Rare books are always expensive. This book is rare because few are graded by CGC. Let's cut through the BS. Understanding comic book rarity is critical to any serious collector, but it's often misrepresented and misunderstood. By the end of this video, you'll have a better sense of comic book rarity and how it intersects with price. I've poured through the data for over 200 comic books from the 1930s until today to provide you with accurate information and insight about rarity. But before we dive into the nitty-gritty, let's start with the basics. Rarity is judged by how many copies of a particular comic book survive today. Comic books can become rare due to two factors. They can be produced in small numbers, and two, reduced by attrition. For example, a book might have an original print run of 100 and all 100 survive today. That's rarity due to minuscule printing. Or a book can have an original print run of 100,000 and only 100 survive today. That's rarity due to severe attrition. Or you can have a combination. A book might have a print run of 1,000 and 100 survive today. That's rarity due to a small print run and to attrition. How does rarity affect the price of a comic book? So many people get this wrong. Rarity itself doesn't make a comic book expensive. For example, many westerns and funny books from the 1940s and 50s aren't worth more than $2 a piece. Conversely, a prevalent book can be worth a lot of money. For example, New Mutants 98, the first appearance of Deadpool, likely has over 100,000 copies still in existence. Nevertheless, a high-grade copy can run you over $1,000. Does this mean that rarity doesn't make a difference when it comes to price? Absolutely not. It is critically important and tightly tied to demand. If there is no demand, a book won't be worth anything regardless of rarity. And if demand is feverish, even a common book can be worth a lot of money. When looking at two books with similar demand, the rare book will be worth more money. For example, both The Flash and Deadpool are popular characters today. And for argument's sake, let's say the demand for their first appearances in comic books is similar. But here's the thing, Flash Comics #1 is hundreds of times rarer than New Mutants 98. The cost of New Mutants 98 in high grade, a 9.8, runs you just under $2,000 today. For Flash Comics #1, there is no 9.8. There's a single copy that's at a 9.6, which sold over 10 years ago for about $400,000. If that book sold today, it would be well over $1 million. That takes us to the next question. How can you determine rarity? Or more specifically, how can you determine the number of books that survive today? This is a tough task. In the early days of collecting, it was experienced collectors and dealers who were leaned on for information about how rare a particular book might be. The research done by the Gerbers and their associates in the late 1980s is probably the best known big effort. They reached out to hundreds of collectors and dealers, and from that input, they create this scarcity index. And they assigned a scarcity number to every single book that they put into the photojournal. Despite this Herculean effort, for the most part, the Gerbers vastly underestimated how many books were out there. I mean, sheesh, they didn't have the internet. For example, one of the books that they featured was Suspense Comics #3. It's a rare book for sure, but they gave it a Gerber 9, meaning they thought that only 6 to 10 copies existed. We now know that there are at least a few dozen copies of this book. Let's fast forward to today. And now we have CGC, which is a far better tool. Every time that CGC grades a book, that book is registered into its census. This method is far from perfect, but it does provide a centralized warehouse that is freely accessible to any collector. Be warned, however, the census is not equally representative of all books. It's a far more useful tool when looking at expensive books as opposed to run-of-the-mill books. That's because grading a comic book takes your time and your money. So if your comic book is worth $2, then grading the book costs more than your book is worth, and you're probably not going to submit it to CGC. That's why you shouldn't get too excited when you look on CGC Census for your filler book from 1992 and see that only a few copies are registered there. On the other hand, if your comic book from the 1960s features the first appearance of a major character, then the cost is far outweighed by the value of getting that book graded. Because CGC has been around now for over 20 years, the census has had an opportunity to build. And over the last few years, the market has been so hot that it's inspired many collectors to send more and more of the books to CGC. So what can be gained by looking at the CGC census numbers through different periods of time? Incredible insights that, frankly, every series collector should know. Okay, it's time to get nerdy. Put on your glasses and pull out your calculators. We're about to analyze some data. Because CGC numbers are more representative for highly valuable books, we'll look at Overstreet's list of top books from each period: gold, silver, bronze, copper, and modern. Let's start with gold. Overstreet lists the top 100 Golden Age books. I looked up each one on CGC Census. Here's what I discovered. These books are rare with a capital R. Median census count is 56, meaning half the top 100 have fewer than 56 copies and half have more. Let's take a look at the top 2 most valuable books of the period. Section 1, the first appearance of Superman, has only 75 books graded. Detective Comics number 27, the first Batman appearance, has only 74. In essence, their rarity is similar to other top 100 most valuable Golden Age books. Why are these books rare? From what I can gather, most Golden Age comic books had high print runs in the hundreds of thousands, so their rarity is due mostly to severe attrition. For example, Action Comics number 1 had a print run of 200,000. Only 75 are on Census today. That's a 99.96% attrition rate. And let me say right now that the actual attrition rate is undoubtedly a little lower. There are always some books that are out in the wild that are yet to be graded, but hey, we're going to have to live with these numbers because there's no way we can know how many books are out there in the wild. The Golden Age sets the standard for rarity. And if I had to give a number for what I believe to be rare, I would say that anything more than 200 is not rare. So 200 and fewer. I'll tell you something that shouldn't be rare, and that's likes to this video. Please make sure that this video gets over 200 likes. Moving up to the late 50s and 60s. We're talking about the Silver Age. We're going to look at the top 50 on the Overstreet list. The median number of copies is 1,247. This is 20 times the median of Golden Age. The 2 books on top of this list are Amazing Fantasy 15 at just over 3,600 and Incredible Hulk number 1 at just under 2,000. These books are a little higher than the median, but in the ballpark. For the most part, the Silver Age most valuable books are from major publishers, and they had relatively high print runs. Attrition for these books was also high, but nothing like the Golden Age. For example, it's estimated that Amazing Fantasy 15 had a print run of 150,000, and so 3,600 represents about a 98% attrition rate. So let's go from the silver and then go to bronze. For bronze, the median is just over 3,100 for the top 25 comic books. That's about triple the silver's median. And let's take a look at the top 2 books. So number 1 is Star Wars number 1, the 35-cent variant, and there are only 285 copies. The number 2 book is Hulk 181, which is the first appearance of Wolverine, with close to 16,000 copies. These 2 books start telling the tale of how a comic book can become valuable in more recent decades. Either there's an extremely low print run because of something kooky, like a 35-cent variant, or a character is so unbelievably popular that copies are costly despite the prevalent numbers. The first appearance of Wolverine in Hulk 181 certainly fits that bill. And we'll take a look at attrition too. For the 35-cent variant of Star Wars 1, it's estimated that there were 1,500 that were printed. That's an 81% attrition rate. And for Hulk 181, it's estimated that 200,000 were printed, or a 92% attrition rate. So we're talking about 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 10 books that were printed that are represented in the census. So by this point, comic book collecting had been established, and many kids and adults thought that their comics would be worth something. So many collectors kept their books, preserved them well, and threatened harm to any family member who even laid a finger on their investment. As a result, comic books from this period aren't affected by attrition like comics from previous decades. Okay, now we're into copper. This is when I first started getting into comic books when I was a kid. And looking at the census numbers of the top 25 copper books, the median is 821. But how can this be? That's rarer than bronze or silver. Let's dig in. The top 3 books are Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 1 with 1,103, Gobbledygook 1, and I'm going to skip this because CGC actually won't grade most copies of it. And that's a story for a different time, maybe another video. And then the third book is Albedo 2. This is the first appearance of Usagi Yojimbo, and there's 279 copies. I want to point out both of these books are not from major publishers. They are from indie publishers that had incredibly low print runs. TMNT 1 had a print run of merely 3,000, and Albedo 2 had an initial run of 2,000. These print runs are so low. And then if a character becomes extremely popular, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, then the supply is far lower than the demand. Nevertheless, I want to point out that there are over 1,100 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle books on Census. So despite a print run that was 100 times smaller than the print runs of many Golden Age books, it's still 20 times more prevalent than the Golden Age's median, which again illustrates the mind-blowing attrition rates for Golden Age books. I digress. Now, a couple of mainstream books from Marvel made this list. Amazing Spider-Man 300, the first Venom, and New Mutants 98, the first appearance of Deadpool. And as you might expect, their census numbers are huge, but the demand is there for them. Thus, they make the top 25. There's also a new trend that is emerging. Some collectors think it's awesome, others think it's hideous. It's the rise of the variants. You may recall that back in the Bronze Age, we got a taste of variants, the Star Wars 35 centers. The 35-cent price was never a gimmick, however. It was Marvel's way of testing out the market's reaction to a price hike. On the other hand, by the 80s, the comic book companies realized that many of the comic books they sold weren't just for reading, viewed as investment vehicles by speculative nerds such as my younger self. So what did they do? They hyped up books in different ways, creating new first issues of major characters, and by manufacturing Rarity by creating relatively small print runs of variants. Some examples include Spider-Man 1, Platinum, Spider-Man 1, Gold, second UPC, whatever the hell that means. This brings us to the modern age. Overstreet lists the top 20, and the median number of books on Census is similar to the Copper Age, only 791. The story of how these books land on the top 20 is a continuation of the Copper Age. Aside from a couple uber popular books, most have low print runs, are gimmicky, or both. The top two books feature major or somewhat major characters with print runs. So number one, there's a census of 417, and there were 3,000 in the initial print run. And Walking Dead number one, CGC Census of close to 3,500 with a print run of about 7,000. So note here with The Walking Dead that about half of the books that were printed have shown up on Census. So it shows you that there's not that much attrition going on. With respect to variants, you'll see books like Ultimate Spider-Man number one, the third series with the City variant cover, or the Unmasked cover. I like Miles Morales, but just shows you that they've got all these different covers for the same comic book. There's an article in here that just sums up comic book collecting and Rarity so well. And it's this awesome article by Craig Holland from slabdata.com. Here's what I find most interesting. He says, variants abound. There are currently about 1.4 million books identified as variants in the CGC Census. He said only 3% of these variants are from dates up to 1989. 6% of graded variants are from the 90s. 15% of graded variants are from the decade of the 2000s, leaving 76% of all CGC graded variants are books printed from 2010 to 2020. And this is one of his remarks. In the industry today, a regular edition, non-variant, with significant resale value seems to be more like a needle in a variant haystack. Ooh, I love that. If you're like me and enjoy comic books that were made rare the old-fashioned way, check out the top 25 comic books in my collection. The majority are Golden Age books. A few are mega keys. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing and hope to see you around real soon.